Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. We're continuing to discuss the outrageous attacks on the Armenian Apostolic Church by Nikol Pashinyan and his government. And today with us, we have Dr. Kevork Hagopjian, an attorney and human rights advocate with expertise in international law, human rights, minority rights, civil litigation, and community engagement.
Definitely looking forward to this discussion, folks. And before we go to Dr. Hagopjian, thanks for listening to us. Thanks for your vote of confidence, your likes, comments, and shares. Please don't forget to do those, and please don't forget to make sure that you're subscribed. And why not donate if you can? Podcasts.groong.org/donate. You can choose from Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon as an option, and become a sustaining donor, sustaining member, and help us plan our shows accordingly and help us reach more people. All right, on to the show.
Dr. Hagopjian, welcome to the Groong podcast.
Thank you. Good morning.
Welcome.
Kevork, this is your first time on our show. Please tell us about yourself and your work in the area of human and minority rights and community engagement.
Definitely. Thank you very much for hosting me this morning. I'm Kevork Hagopjian, an attorney and human rights advocate with some expertise in international law, minority rights, civil litigation, and, as you said, community engagement. I hold a PhD in law from University of Vienna and two LLMs, one of them from University of London SOAS in international law and another one in US law from Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. My doctoral research focused on minority rights, particularly the Armenian minority rights in Turkey and Lebanon under international and national laws. Currently, I work as an attorney in California. I work at Chaosian Law LLP in the civil litigation department, focusing on mass torts cases. Apart from that, I'm actively engaged with the Armenian National Committee of America. I'm on the board of Western Region, as well as the Armenian Legal Center for Justice and Human Rights. And I also support the Armenian Bar Association's Pro Bono Clinic.
Thank you for all that. That's a very active life you have. For our listeners, we're putting everything in Dr. Hagopjian's bio, which you can access through our show notes, podcasts.groong.org/episode number. Okay, well, let's jump into our topics, Kevork. Now, Pashinyan has a political problem. He's deeply unpopular. He's heading into an election in June 2026. He lost a catastrophic war in 2020, and most Armenian institutions called for his resignation, including the Armenian Apostolic Church, which, by the way, is the most highly trusted institution in Armenia. And that, by far, it is twice as popular as any government ministry, agency, or institution in the country. But after everything, Pashinyan did survive those calls for his resignation in 2021. But he also has a geopolitical problem. His cling to power at this point depends on Turkey and Azerbaijan's support, and he gets, unfortunately, his signals from Baku or Ankara. When in May 2025, a year ago, the Catholicos, went to a peace conference in Bern, Switzerland, and openly talked about the right of return of Artsaksis to their homeland and the destruction of Christian Armenian monuments and heritage in Artsakh, the reaction from Baku was swift. Their top cleric, Alashukur Pashazadeh, called the Catholicos and the Armenian Church terrorists, and he called for their neutralization. And then we heard the same thing from Azer media and government ministries. And the next reaction was also swift. Pashinyan kicked in with frivolous charges and arrests against the Catholicos and bishops and archbishops and priests and deacons loyal to the Catholicos. Kevork, your Asbares article on December 3rd, 2025 was detailed and thoughtful, and you started with first principles. The Armenian constitution protects freedom of religion, affirms the separation of church and state, and recognizes the Armenian Apostolic Church's exclusive mission in national life, according to Article 18. You're right. So Pashinyan's government appears to be operating not only just illegally, but also unconstitutionally. And he has doubled down with presenting his so-called vision of reforming the church, blocking access to churches, forcing uncanonical liturgy on defrocked priests, and so on. So please tell us, in plain terms, what does state neutrality require the government to do and not to do?
Wow, this was a heavy introduction.
I tried to put it in a
And
nutshell.
yes,
And this is the short story if we were to get into
yes,
it.
it is, and very nicely summarized, I would say. Let me start with a brief introduction on what do we mean when we say separation of church and state. Separation of church and state means two things at once. First, the state doesn't control religion and religious institutions. And second, religion doesn't run the state. But it doesn't mean silencing religious voices as long as the church is not trying to exercise a state authority, such as controlling the police, writing laws, fixing or administering elections. And its leaders are free to speak like any other citizens or any other non-state actors. So basically, it's mainly a rule for the state, not a muzzle on religion. And it also is a barrier to religious institutions exercising state power, as I mentioned. Freedom of religion is a basic and human rights, and it is codified both in international law, international human rights law, and at Armenia's institution, as you mentioned, Article 18 of the and 1718 of the Armenia's current constitution. So freedom of religion basically guarantees the inner freedom to believe or not to believe. This is an absolute right. No state can intervene into this. And also the freedom to practice and organize religion alone or with others. The state has a very basic duty, and that duty is to remain neutral and impartial. So the government, any government, I'm not talking about the Armenian government, as long as they are part of the international human rights treaties, they must not declare some beliefs as good and others as bad. They cannot choose or remove religious leaders. They cannot take sides in internal church disputes, so on and so forth. And also, religious communities and religious institutions have a right to internal autonomy and to have their own internal charters, regulations, procedures, processes in place to choose their own leaders, to discipline those who violate their internal rules, to manage their own property and institutions, as long as they respect general laws such as the criminal law of the state or the civil law of the state. And the state can interfere only when there are violations of the public orders or others' rights are violated. So the state cannot use law to punish the wrong theology or criticism or any contradictions to their state foreign policies, let's say. So these are the essence of freedom of religion and belief, and what do we mean by separation of state and church. So it doesn't mean that the church doesn't have a voice to raise when it comes to political issues or issues of national concern or pan-Armenian related agendas. In contrary, the church, as one of the most important pan-Armenian non-state institutions, has a legal and moral duty to stand up, to provide guidance, to provide some solutions when the nation is going through turmoils or facing genocidal threats, wars, crimes against humanity, so on and so forth.
So when it comes to this exclusive mission in the Constitution, put together with the concept of separation of church and state, how do they fit together legally? What do they authorize? What do they forbid, in a sense?
Okay, from the state's point of view, the state has legally three obligations or three duties. The first one is to respect, the second one is to duty to protect, and the third one is the duty to fulfill or to satisfy. Let's put these three duties within the framework of freedom of religion and belief. When we say the state has a duty to respect, we mean that the state should not interfere into the internal affairs of the church or any affair, any matter, or to any things that are related to belief systems, election of leaders, management of the communities, appointments of bishops, defrocking bishops, clergies, so on and so forth. The state should respect the autonomy of the religious institution, should not interfere, again, as long as the church or any religious institution is not violating the rules and regulations and laws. The second duty is to protect. For example, when the church is under attack, or let's assume any of the churches is vandalized, the state has a duty to investigate, to prosecute, to hold all those responsible accountable. Or let's take another example, the videos that were leaked for Archbishop Arshak. The state has a duty to investigate that incident because that was a severe violation of the rights of privacy of that clergy, and that constitutes a severe breach of someone's personal life. So the state has a duty to investigate and initiate a criminal procedure to find out who and how and what did happen. And or for example, now we have some defrocked priests who are still not abandoning their positions, or they are still conducting their services within the church. In theory and in reality, the state, the church could have asked the state's intervention because they are not anymore legitimate to take the altar. But what we are witnessing is the opposite. The state, instead of protecting the church from those who have been defrocked, they are facilitating access and supporting the activities of those who are defrocked by the church. You see what I mean? So the state actually in this very scenario is doing exactly the opposite of what duties they have to do. The third is to fulfill by, for example, allowing, providing lands, or exempting the church from taxes, so on and so forth, by providing means and legal avenues and legal tools to facilitate the church or to support the church in facilitating its mission. Again, what we are witnessing, a couple of weeks ago, there were discussions that the state moving forward will not offer land for free to the Armenian church, which is again a departure from its internationally ratified obligations. The state of Armenia is part of the European Convention of Human Rights and also ratified the several bills of human rights, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which these two treaties alone, the European Convention of Human Rights and the ICCPR, put clear duties on the state to respect, protect, and fulfill the obligations when it comes to freedom of religion and belief. And as I demonstrated, the current authorities with Pashinyan, they are violating, not only they are disrespecting their duties, but they are crossing all constitutional lines by violate. These are not only bad actions, they are legally violations of state obligations and violations of international human rights law. So now from the point of the church, what the church can do or legally is allowed to do. Again, the church, as you mentioned in the introduction, is one of the most influential institutions that we have in our reality. And the church, no matter how influential or important is, at the end, legally speaking, is a non-state actor. And as a non-state actor, it enjoys all the freedoms and rights that any non-state actor enjoys in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of internally regulating their affairs, so on and so forth. So putting within this context, the church, in addition to the rights that they enjoy as a non-state actors, has a constitutional status. The Article 18 of the Armenian Constitution gives a specific mission to the Armenian Church, and the Armenian Church has a unique position within the Armenian legal system by having this important place or a status that regulates the state and church relationship. This is why when the Armenian Church practices actually its right by raising concerns, by defending the rights of Artsaksis, by claiming their lost properties. At the end, let's not forget that dozens, if not hundreds, of religious sites and religious heritage were occupied in Artsakh recently, and the church has a legal duty. Let's forget all the other duties to protect its property and to claim its properties back. So this is what the church is doing actually. The fact that it is not in line or in harmony with the current foreign policy of the state doesn't justify the oppression and the efforts to delegitimize and restructure the church by the current government.
We want to talk about some of those examples that you mentioned to greater detail, but allow me one question right before that. If the government says it's exercising free speech, you know, how Pashinyan has said he is just trying to reform the church because he's a concerned Christian, I guess. What's the legal test for when speech becomes state interference? In the sense, if the Catholicos calls for Pashinyan's resignation, and that is protected speech, why is a prime minister calling for the Catholicos to resign not equally protected?
Well, because very simply, because the state has a duty of neutrality and impartiality. And when the state and the head of a state calls for the resignation of the Catholicos or initiates the so-called reform process, it directly violates its duty of neutrality and impartiality, and it interferes directly into the religious and internal matters of the non-state actors. It has nothing to do with the freedom of speech argument, because they are not making this speech as individuals, but rather as representatives of the state. And the proof of this is having Pashinyan's signature under the declaration of the recent declaration for that puts forward a pathway or a roadmap for
A vision for
reforming
reform.
the church. So that is a clear, by the way, that declaration, legally speaking, has no legal effect. With that declaration, nothing can be changed. Neither the church can be reformed, nor the internal charter of the church can be revised, nor the Catholicos can be removed, because it's not a law, it's just a declaration without any legal effect. But the symbolic and the legal implication of that declaration is the proof that the state is crossing all the constitutional lines and violating its duties of neutrality and impartiality. This is the difference. When the Catholicos speaks, again, I will reiterate, he speaks as a representative of a non-state actor When Pashinyan speaks, he speaks as the head of the state, and this is the main difference.
Kevork, hearing you talk about all of this, I mean, it seems to be very black and white in that the government cannot sponsor parallel church structures. It cannot act to weaken one particular religion or any religion, I would say. Yet Pashinyan seems to be doing completely the opposite. We saw there are allegations that it is actively instigating this process, including potentially bribing or paying off clergy who decide to join him. Now that's not confirmed, but those are the allegations in the media. And starting from this new year, besides the statement that you mentioned, I fear that Pashinyan is trying to institutionalize this process. He created this structure, and he keeps referring to it as the so-called Apostolic Church of
Council.
Armenia, right?
Yes.
Council, but and he's deliberately naming it as the Apostolic Church of Armenia. What's worrisome is that the renegade bishops that decided to join him are also using that name. So it is not just a coincidence. Meanwhile, the official name of the Armenian Church is the Armenian Apostolic Church, just for the record. But we have more news. After the Vehapar dismissed one of the renegade bishops, which I believe is the right of the Catholicos, because the Catholicos is the overall executive of the Armenian Apostolic Church, he dismissed Bishop Kevork Saroyan, head of the Masyatsotin Diocese in Armenia, just 2 days ago. Well, immediately, Pashinyan's newspaper quoted Pashinyan. Pashinyan's newspaper is, of course, Armenian Times, but of course he has all the government newspapers as well. But that's the one that's owned by his family. Anyway, Pashinyan's newspaper quoted him saying that he does not recognize this decision, and according to him, Archbishop Kevork continues to remain the head of the diocese. Meanwhile, I believe Archbishop Asorik has been appointed by the Vehapar already. What is the I mean, initially we were going to ask a lot of questions like how can Armenia avoid trying to create a schism, try to create parallel religions, but are we basically past that point of no return where the government has officially given credence to a schismatic church, a schismatic grouping within the church, and how do you see this resolving in the future?
It's extremely difficult to predict the upcoming developments because it's extremely difficult to predict what Pashinyan can do. But at this time, at this stage, I think we should not assume that certain scenarios would be impossible. Everything is possible with this regime. Everything is possible, and what we are witnessing is a clear and deliberate, systematic violations of international and constitutional obligations. This doesn't mean that there is no light at the end of the tunnel, because eventually the people have a say. And eventually, all these scenarios will have its repercussions within the society at large. And the Armenian Church as an institution have legal mechanisms and legal avenues that they can rely on to pursue justice by starting locally and then uh, going to the European Court of Human Rights. However, this even if we get a judgment or a ruling from the European Convention of Human Rights, there is no guarantee that this regime will adhere to the rulings of the European Courts of Human Rights, as was the case, for example, with the arbitration decision when it comes to Samuel Garabedian's case and the electric company that they seized. So what I'm trying to say, yes, what we are witnessing is unprecedented within the Armenian context, but it is not unprecedented within the European case law. Whatever you are describing happened in Latvia, happened in Bulgaria in the past, and the court dealt with it according to the context of that time. And in order to address these challenges, we need to be very clear that these violations will not go unpunished, and everyone will be accountable eventually for all these violations. So it's very delicate situation. It's a very sensitive situation. The state and the church, again, they have their own resources, and I don't think that the church is still investing properly in its own resources that as an institution it has.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult when, for instance, you dismiss one of the bishops and the police actually protect the bishop instead of asking him
Instead
to
of
vacate the
asking the bishop
premises.
to leave the premises. This
Yeah.
is what I try to. The irony is this: the state has an obligation to protect the church, but what we are witnessing is the opposite.
Yeah.
That the church is allowing those who are not supposed to be at the church by decisions taken by the church according to the internal rules and regulations of the church. We might not disagree with all the decisions of the church. We might criticize the church, but when we are talking about legal procedures and rule of law, the state is deliberately and in a very steady manner is departing from the concept of rule of
Yeah.
law when it comes to this dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my only concern is this, that instead of focusing on more existential matters, it seems that the aim is to shift the attention of the public from more existential issues, such as the so-called peace treaty between Azerbaijan and Armenia, such as the ongoing occupation of the Armenian territories, internationally recognized Armenian territories of the Republic of Armenia, the occupation of the Republic of Artsakh, the rights of return of the more than 150,000 Artsakhtsis, the release of the prisoners of war and the hostages in Baku, the accumulated billions of dollars of debt that the current government fails to manage, all the other socioeconomic difficulties that the public is going through, even the basic needs of the public is not met. I've have relatives that they are saying they are not having electricity for 15 hours sometimes in the midst of this severe winter in Armenia. So instead of focusing on all these existential matters and considering what the region is going through, the tension in Iran, what's going on in Iran nowadays, all these developments, we are focusing on matters that are really ridiculous to
Yeah.
discuss. Yes, I agree. The church needs reform. The church needs to improve its efficiency and effectiveness. The church needs to increase its transparency and accountability, and it needs to go back to its roots, to be with the grassroots and with faithful and so on and so forth. But all this does not justify all the illegal and unconstitutional actions taken by the current government.
I know this is not a legal question, but I'm going to ask it since you mentioned a few of the international aspects of it. What do you think is driving Pashinyan to do this right now? Because we have elections for 6 months from now. The church is clearly one of the most popular institutions. I don't know how Pashinyan would score rating points by attacking the church. So is this like a personal vendetta, or do you believe it's an attempt? I mean, is there a geopolitical aspect to this perhaps? What are your personal thoughts about this?
Well, I would say multifaceted dynamics play a role. One of them is the fact that decades of attempts to delegitimize the status and authority and the spiritual value of the church within by certain circles in Armenia started to bear some fruit. So I'm not 100% sure about the popularity of the Armenian church. That it has the same popularity as it used to have throughout centuries, because there were deliberate attacks on the legitimacy and the authority of the church and church leaders in the last couple of decades, especially in the last 7, 8 years. And also, let's not forget the political dynamics, and we haven't mentioned it so far. Pashinyan has been accusing the church of aligning with foreign powers. Let's be clear, let's be straightforward, that, with Moscow and Russia. And this is again not new within the European case law. There are other countries that they again attacked certain religious communities back in early 1990s because they were accusing them of being pro-Soviet. So this is not a new phenomena, but this is the heaviest and the most dangerous accusation a state can make. And this requires proper investigation, transparent processes, and evidence. If you don't have evidence, you cannot misuse this kind of allegations for political purposes and pure propaganda. This is what Pashinyan is doing. Otherwise, we should have witnessed some proper investigations going on addressing these serious allegations. So again, there are lots of dynamics, and the fact that the current government justifies all its actions either by uh, accusing the past regimes or accusing foreigners, again draws a clear picture on what's going on. This is the main dilemma that we are dealing with. On one hand, we are claiming that we are against foreign intervention to our internal affairs, while on the other hand, we are seeking support from the European Union for the upcoming elections. So again, we need to see all these developments within this political framework. But I'm trying to stay in the legal field and analyze all these developments from legal perspectives and not political perspectives. Again, legally speaking, all these accusations are baseless as long as there are no concrete evidence and due processes where the rule of law is respected and the accused is given the chance to defend themselves, so on and so forth. And I also agree with the timing that Aspet was mentioning at the very beginning. All this rumors about internal affairs, about the Catholicos fathered a child, about others being involved in corruption, so on and so forth. All these rumors were all over the yellow media over the years. What happened all of a sudden that it turned into a state priority? Where were they? Why they were not raising all these issues all the way up until Catholicos Karakin went to Switzerland and Pashazadeh started making accusations and demands. The timing is very, very important. How all of a sudden, after one interview, a philanthropist can be detained? Why they were not detaining him in advance? I mean, there are lots of questions
Yeah.
that we can ask and discuss, but let's stay within the legal arena.
I guess we can, but when you were talking about the yellow journalism, when you put a yellow journalist as your prime minister, I guess you get a trade rag for a country. Sorry to editorialize a little bit, but I did want to ask an important question following your explanation above. Is this whole issue, can we consider this whole issue about the church a red herring then, trying to um, obfuscate other more existential issues? Because Hovig and I discuss this quite often. Is this really an issue? Is this a thing or not a thing? But the issue is that we cannot ignore it, because if we ignore it, it'll be misinterpreted as apathy and it will be used against the church, right? So you have to have some kind of a response.
Yes, and the response is very straightforward, and the response is to stand in solidarity and support with the Armenian Apostolic Church, even if we have some disagreements or demands from the church to reform itself, to modernize itself, so on and so forth. Now we passed that stage. What I'm saying that is the following. Considering the legal, political, and existential consequences of this attack and oppression against the church, every single one of us has a duty to stand in solidarity and support with the church and to denounce all these accusations and actions and like this is not the time to talk about others. It is the time to stop this ongoing violations, because we are talking about ongoing violations and ongoing departure from rule of law. This
Yeah,
is not about a conflict between the church and a state. This is deeper than that. This is a
yeah.
constitutional crisis. This is a departure from the rule of law, and someone, and we as a nation, we need to put an end to this catastrophic situation.
Kevork, yes, coming back to the law, in fact, criminal law, you in your article alluded that the government uses the law selectively, either to criminally prosecute outspoken critics, give overwhelmingly long, let's say, pretrial detention sentences, and also fail to prosecute other crimes of the same magnitude or even worse crimes. And we witnessed that in terms of the some of the things that we mentioned, such as the protection of excommunicated or defrocked bishops, protection, attempting to actually go into the church property to seize archbishops when they're actually doing, religious ceremonies and services. Can you back this up though with a little bit more evidence, where there are cases, could all of these actually be ordinary law enforcement? Could, for instance, the prosecution of Archbishop Mikhail Hagopjian be considered legitimate because he said a few things that he shouldn't have? Um, what evidence can you provide to back up your assertion that this is selective prosecution or lack of prosecution, or I guess selective prosecution, or and then also in terms of the some of the pretrial detention, some of the mechanisms used to keep people in jail despite the lack of a verdict yet?
Well, I completely agree with your statements in terms of like discriminatory approach when it comes to the application of the criminal law, and we can see that in several instances and how the prosecution uh, within couple of hours even they oblige they somehow they have it seems that they have this obligation to show loyalty to the prime minister. Every time the prime minister asks for something, they need to fulfill that demand or action, even though it can be illegal or without proper evidence or without any legal causation. So we witnessed this, and there are lots of other examples. For example, the case of the pregnant woman who was killed by Pashinyan's convoy. We saw what happened with that criminal proceeding.
That
We
was
saw it.
Sonam Natsaganyan.
Yes,
Absolutely, yeah.
yes. So this is one very clear example on how the law was implemented. Another example would be all these allegations of corruptions when it comes to contracting with third-party vendors. There are lots of accusations, but we haven't seen any criminal investigation for these rumors. Another example would be the case of those soldiers who were burned in their
Barracks,
station.
makeshift barracks, yeah.
Yes. So there are lots of similar cases where we can discuss that the rule of law is not implemented equally within the legal system. And when it comes to criminal investigation, we need to differentiate. When there are allegations of misconduct that doesn't amount to criminal investigation when it comes to the clergy, I'm saying it's the duty and responsibility of the church to investigate and not the state. The state intervenes only when there is a criminal conduct, but not any misconduct. For let's take the example of Archbishop Arshak, and you saw how what happened with him, why they detained him. Again, instead of protecting him by promptly initiating a criminal investigation on how that video was leaked, or whether it was an AI video, whether it was montaged, so on and so forth, they accused the Archbishop with something that is very, very ridiculous, to say it bluntly, that happened a couple of years ago. The same
7 years
applies
ago,
to,
yeah.
yeah, 7 years ago. So these are examples of selective law application, which is which is totally against how the rule of law should be applied within any democratic and modern state. If you are claiming,
Yeah, Kevork, a quick question about the sloppy forensics and the selective criminalization that is going on. What does that tell us about due process and how such cases would be invalidated purely on technical bases, let alone the fact that there's no crime there to investigate?
yeah, it means that we still have a very long way to go. It shows that how fragile and uh, unindependent the and the judiciary branch of the Republic of Armenia is, and how it is still dependent and influenced by political agendas and political dynamics. This is a very clear indication on the lack of independence and lack of maturity of the judicial branch as a branch of the state. And it doesn't mean that the clergy cannot be lawfully prosecuted when there is genuine evidence of serious crimes. But what we have been witnessing so far, that without genuine evidence of serious crimes, people are being detained, arrested, harassed, intimidated, so on and so forth. These are unlawful, undemocratic, illegal actions that the state should not and must not adopt.
Mhm. So in your article, you note that Pashinyan's escalation of this whole matter is clearly tied to the Bern Conference on Artsakh heritage and rights, followed by criticism from Azerbaijan's senior cleric. The whole thing triggered a domestic campaign against the Catholicos. You also note that advocacy for cultural heritage, right of return, and human rights claims is protected speech under the ICCPR and the ECHR standards, even when it conflicts with the government's diplomatic line, right? I read an interesting article also in the Mirror Spectator by Sergio Nahabedian. This happened over the weekend. He characterizes Pashinyan's motives even more bluntly. He says, silencing the church as a powerful critic after the loss of Artsakh. So everybody seems to be on the same page here. And it clearly connects Pashinyan's church-state conflict not to his alleged so-called moral issues with the Catholicos, but to regional pressure and narrative control. What makes the timing of events and causality legally relevant? And what alternative explanations should we test to avoid this kind of confirmation bias?
Well, if it proves something, it proves that all these are excuses to justify their illegal actions and to cover up their main intentions. These are the timing, as I explained earlier on, is really, really very important. Because when there are public announcements made by Azeri authorities that are being echoed by Armenian representatives, this shows clearly that there is a coordination among the parties to silence one of the most influential non-state actors. And legally speaking, this weakens all their claims or all their justifications for the reasons that they are taking these steps. You see what I mean? Because if you take out all these actions, the recent developments, and let's assume it happened 15 years ago, the analysis would have been different. Because back then the situation was different and the dynamics were different. The geopolitical situation was different. We didn't have Artsakh lost. We didn't have, for the first time in thousands of years, the indigenous population of Artsakh forcibly displaced through genocidal acts of blockade and forced displacement. So we didn't have all this, and we could have explained or somehow understood all these actions, although again, they are illegal and unlawful. But the timing is extremely crucial to analyze and to legally undress, if I can use this word, the motives behind these actions. And the motivation is really very important when it comes to legal analysis and the intent. So legally speaking, the intent is different from what it is being claimed to be. The intent is to brush the Artsakh issue under the carpet, to close that chapter, to move on, to subjugate the church, to control the church, to keep the political power in the upcoming elections. So these are the main motives behind all these actions. It's not about reforming the church. It's not about moral calls. It's not about definitely being faithful to the Armenian church. It's about all this geopolitical wider dynamics and aims.
Okay. Earlier, you mentioned that some of these processes, legal processes by the detainees, can be escalated all the way to the ECHR. As a matter of fact, I believe that Archbishop Hagopjian is applying to the ECHR. Can you tell us what can be expected, what kind of support could be expected from an international court at this point in time? And I just want to add that I am concerned because while we are talking about legalistic issues here, we are dealing with a government that's not interested in legality, being legal or even constitutional. And they are supported, as a matter of fact, by Europe, Turkey, Azerbaijan. So we can have courts say something, but if these governments that own the police don't want to have anything to do with that, what kind of support could be expected?
Yes, politically, they might be supported, and I agree with you. Because for the European powers, what matters is to neutralize the Russian influence and within the region. And whatever supports that agenda, they will have no say in that. And Pashinyan is convincing the European entities that whoever is against this current government is a pro-Russian regime. This is why we are not seeing politically very anti-Pashinyan rhetoric within the European circles. However, legally speaking, this is not the case. And the proof of that is what we have achieved in front of the ICJ. And when it comes to the Artsakh issue and ICJ's decision, International Court of Justice's decision demanding the return of Artsakhis to their lands. And this is also why the Armenian government is willing to withdraw all of its
Yeah,
international
absolutely. I
legal
was just going to
cases
mention that.
from internet. So these are all connected. However, when it comes to the European Convention of Human Rights, there are some requirements. And the first, one of the most important requirements is to exhaust the local remedies before applying in front of the European Court of Human Rights. However, when certain threats are imminent and there are certain circumstances where the court can adopt interim measures requesting the state to take steps. So one of the scenarios that I foresee is that after applying to the European Court of Human Rights, even though the local remedies are not exhausted yet, the European Court of Human Rights can adopt an interim measure requesting the state of Armenia to take concrete steps when it comes to all these detained clergy and other political prisoners. Let's not forget, it's not only half of the archbishops in Armenia who are detained now. There are other prisoners or detainees or folks under home arrests for political purposes and they are political prisoners. So we shouldn't forget or undermine the faith and the rights of all those who are being persecuted because of their opposition to the current government.
Kevork, this has been a very interesting discussion. We talked about this government's various forms of overreach, prosecution of the opposition, persecution of the opposition, persecution of the church, and all of this, I think, with the ultimate aim, in my opinion, to at least chiefly to satisfy external geopolitical, whether it's interests of the current government or demands or instructions given to the current government.
By
And
enemies.
by the enemies, of course. And this also chiefly includes, and we're seeing it in front of our eyes, the re-architecture of the Armenian identity, the splitting of Armenia from the diaspora. All of these things are happening, and it seems like at a pace that is difficult to comprehend and even just document. But I should also mention that according to, I know you said you don't believe them, but multiple polls agree that the Armenian church still has tremendous ratings in Armenia. And in fact, one of the questions asked in the previous MPG poll that we discussed on our podcast two or three episodes ago was, who do you believe would be capable of restoring solidarity and harmony in society after all of these, issues and conflicts. And it was the number one. It was the church, and specifically, it was. It even ranked clergy. I think number one was Mikhail Ajapahian, Archbishop Mikhail Ajapahian, and number two was Catholicos Garigin II. So, with all of that, I just want to ask you, what is a clean off ramp do you see from this crisis that restores trust and solidarity within the society and ensures that blanket impunity is not granted to anyone like we're seeing today?
That's a tough one, isn't it?
It's a very tough one. And to be honest with you, knowing the uh, system in Armenia and knowing how the elections can be defrauded and knowing all the past elections, I cannot say the election would be the only way moving forward. But I also trust on the wisdom of the Armenian people. I wonder when the awakening will take place, because I still feel that we are not awakened. We are not realizing as a whole, as a big society, the existential threats that we are facing. I think one of the few steps that we can take is to solidify all the opposition powers around common ground, around couple of national priorities. And that is something doable. And having an interim leadership with credibility and with trust among the public, both from the homeland and diaspora, to facilitate a transition from this divided and polarized reality, internally speaking, to a more harmonized and united in diversity. I'm not saying that we need everyone should think the same way, everyone should believe in the same things. I'm saying we can be united in our diverse political, social perspectives, and we can find common ground by prioritizing our main pan-Armenian national interests, by prioritizing that no matter what, our pan-Armenian institutions, including the Armenian Apostolic Church, cannot be delegitimized, cannot be silenced up, should not be prosecuted, should not be under attack because of doing the right thing at the right moment of the history.
Those are powerful words, Kevork,
Yeah.
and I think those are that's a good spot to end our podcast on a more positive note. So let's leave it here for today. Thank you, Kevork. Thank you, Dr. Hagopjian. And we hope to
Sure.
have you back again in the
Thanks
future
to
to
you.
discuss issues of your competence.
Thank you, Kevork.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Aspet. Thank you, Obi. Pleasure meeting you.
Okay, Hovig, that's our show today. This episode was recorded on January 12, 2026, and we've been talking with Dr. Kevork Hagopjian, who is an attorney and human rights advocate with expertise in international law, minority rights, civil litigation, community engagement. I urge all of our listeners to go to our show notes, podcast.groong.org/episode number. Check him out, and you can check everything else out because we will put some notes in there.
Thank you, folks, for staying with us. And don't forget to make sure that you're subscribed. Don't forget to like, comment, and share our podcast on all the platforms that you're active on, and help us gain a little boost. And also donate to us if you can. podcasts.groong.org/donate. You know, I'm trying to think of what we can do to make it more to increase the likelihood of donations. I think that you know, maybe you can tell us in the comments, like if you want me to eat harissa on live air, I don't know, maybe I can do that and get some harissa humanitarian points, or Aspet, maybe, like, you know, I don't know. I don't like lahmacun in Yerevan, so if you have to eat lahmacun, then it's going to be
You have to
Aspet.
be here.
And I
Yeah.
would
Actually, the best
suggest old
lahmacun I've had is
Sasun.
in Beirut, Ovig.
Well, I don't know about Beirut, but in LA, I would strongly recommend Old Sasun Bakery. But while you're eating your yummy lahmacun, go to podcast.groong.org/donate and send us some yummy donations. Thank you very much. And I am Hovik Manucharian from Occupied Yerevan.
And I'm Aspet Bedrosian in Glendale, California. We'll talk to you soon, folks.
Have a great day and have a great week.